Israel in Gaza. All right, let's continue on with this conversation. I want to bring into the conversation Vice President for Foreign Policy with JINSA, Blaise Misztal. Blaise, thank you so much for joining us here on Live Now from Fox for the latest. What do we make of this latest round of airstrikes by the U.S. against the Houthis, and what type of message is President Trump trying to send?
Well, good afternoon, Andy. It's good to be with you. I think this action is long overdue. And National Security Advisor Waltz was absolutely correct when he said that the situation in the Red Sea has been unacceptable. If 2 years ago you had asked any U.S. national security official if the U.S. could accept a ragtag group of terrorists using basically flying lawnmowers to stop maritime traffic going through one of the most important areas in the world, an area through which 10% of all global energy and something like 30% of all commercial container traffic goes through, everyone would have said that is not acceptable, that a fundamental interest of the United States, a reason that we have the Navy and the military that we have, is to protect the global freedom of navigation, to make sure that energy and commerce can flow around the world because we benefit from that. And yet that's exactly what we allowed to happen for the last 18 months, is this group of terrorists to divert billions and billions of dollars of commerce through a crucial waterway. And the Biden administration did very little about it. There was a handful of pinprick attacks by the Biden administration that hit maybe some weapons storage facilities, maybe some logistics hubs, but did very little damage to the Houthis. And then it's no wonder that this group kept on firing at both commercial ships and U.S. vessels. And so putting a stop to this is absolutely important. But the question is, what is the Trump administration strategy here? How do they plan to get the Houthis to back down? Heavy strikes going after the Houthi leadership is obviously a major advance from what we saw the Biden administration do, but we haven't really heard yet what is the plan? How do they think they're going to win this? How are they going to make the Houthis back down?
Yeah, and we'll get into that. What's next? Big question in just a little bit. I do want to ask you about that, how this is different from the Biden administration, because we have seen a different tone as they also designated the Houthis as a foreign terrorist organization. This, a post from Mike Waltz, who we also just saw on Fox News during that segment, talking about President Trump taking decisive action against the Houthis to protect American personnel and assets. Biden's feckless leadership emboldened the Houthis. In terms of this, you mentioned the little small airstrikes by President Biden versus what's going on with Trump. Can you decipher a little bit and give more understanding on how they are different than what we saw in the previous administration?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple differences that we're seeing so far, and we're about 48 hours into this. The first is a preference for offense over defense. The Biden administration mostly deployed U.S. military assets in and around the Red Sea to try to stop, that is, defeat the drones and the missiles that the Houthis were shooting at ships going through that area. And that meant that we were shooting missiles that cost millions of dollars to try to take down drones that cost tens of thousands of dollars, which is a very costly and ultimately losing proposition. But that was mostly the Biden administration's approach. Try to defend the ships going through there. Occasionally, there were limited strikes that went out of their way, usually to avoid killing Houthis or civilians, mostly targeting what was believed to be empty infrastructure. And right afterwards, the Biden administration would always say, we don't want to escalate. We don't want this conflict to get wider. And so a big difference here is both the severity of the strikes that we're seeing from the Trump administration, the targets that are being hit. We've heard that there is Houthi leadership that are being targeted. That is a big change. But also the messaging, whereas the Biden administration always said, we don't want to hit you. We want to back down. We want to resolve this. We don't want to escalate. We've heard President Trump saying, we will let hell rain down on you if you don't back down. So there's also a difference in tone and suggestion of what comes next. But I think that is ultimately the question. What does come next? The Biden administration didn't have a plan. It was an attack here, an attack there. There was nothing that really made sense. And so are we just seeing one weekend of strikes, or is this going to be a continued campaign? Is there a plan on what to hit to really make the Houthis hurt? I think that is the question now.
Yeah, and of course, the Trump administration, President Trump and the White House have said that they will continue these attacks until they cease the attacks, the Houthis attacks there in the Red Sea. So like you said, the plan of what comes next. And of course, Mike Waltz also alluding to the fact that Iranian targets might be next in Yemen. Do you see that as a real possibility?
Yeah, I think that is the big question here. Is this part of, or rather, is this just a campaign against the Houthis and the Houthis themselves? Or is this a campaign against the broader Iranian terror network that has funded and supported war across the Middle East, in Gaza by Hamas, in Lebanon by Hezbollah, in Syria by Assad, and by the Houthis in Yemen? We know that those first three have been dismantled by Israel and by others. The Houthis are the last remaining piece of this. It's one thing to go after them, but then the question is, what about taking this back to where it all starts? What about taking this back to Iran? Are we actually going to deal with the source of the problem in Tehran, or are we just going to try to take apart its network? And I think that's what we're waiting to see from the Trump administration. And I think it's very possible that this is actually part of a broader strategy. We know that President Trump has offered to negotiate with the Iranians, but also said, if you don't negotiate, we're going to come after you. And I think this might be part of sending that message to Tehran, that he's willing to use force and he's willing to go after them.
Yeah, and this comes after the negotiation tactic by President Trump to try to have a deal, a negotiation about those nuclear arms that they continue to enrich the uranium. I do want to ask you about this region because you mentioned just the critical nature of the Red Sea, the Suez Canal. This is a post from the White House as this where the airstrikes were happening. I do want to ask you, so 25,000 merchant ships go through it, $1 trillion through the Red Sea annually. We've seen it in the past where the U.S. Navy has to escort different merchant ships through the Red Sea. Do you think that is something that could happen if the Houthis do not cease to make these airstrikes on different vessels there?
Yeah, well, I think what we've seen over the course of the last 18 months is that commercial traffic has really dried up. And instead, what you're having is ships, instead of going through the Red Sea and the Suez Canal, they're taking the long way around, going down south around Africa and back up on Africa's western coast to get to Europe, to get to the United States, adding time and something like $1 million in cost to every ship that has to go around the Red Sea. And I think that's likely to remain the case as long as the Houthis are there. And I think that's one of the reasons that the Trump administration is doing this, because they understand the threat, not just to shipping in the Red Sea, but the message this sends to China. If a bunch of terrorists can do this in the Red Sea, what are the ideas that China is going to get about what it can do in the East China Sea? And that's, I think, also part of this calculation, is sending a message to not just the Iranians, but also the Chinese.
Yeah, and we look at this all in the whole scope of things because there's so many different factors and facets around it. I do want to get back maybe to the premise of this initial attacks by the Houthis, is the fact that they are responding to Israel not allowing aid into Gaza. What does Israel play in this role? What role do they have if they opened up more aid to Gaza? Do you think the Houthis might back down? What is Israel and what can Israel do in this scenario, what we're looking at now?
Yeah, so first of all, let's be clear. This has nothing to do with Israel. This is Iran flexing its muscles and terrorizing the world. The ships that the Houthis have been firing at are American, they're Liberian, they're Chinese, they're from all over the world. They're not Israeli, and they're carrying goods that are not going to Israel. They're going to all over the world. So this is an attack not on Israel. It's an attack on the world. But at the same time, we have seen, especially in the last couple of months of last year, the Houthis began attacking directly into Israel, shooting missiles and drones into Israel with some success. And I think that is the question now. Is this going to remain contained to the Red Sea? Are they going to start attacking the Israelis again? And what does that do where Israel has largely had a ceasefire for the last several months? Or do the Houthis escalate beyond just those two options? There was a war between the Houthis and Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates between 2014 and 2018. That included the Houthis shooting missiles and drones into the kingdom, into the Emirates, hitting some really substantial targets, showing that they really have the reach to hit the whole region. So how widely will they respond? And is the Trump administration, is the United States ready to protect our allies in Israel, in Saudi Arabia, in the UAE? I think that's what we're going to be watching next.
Yeah, a lot of questions still left to be answered in terms of this region. And you mentioned another different point of tension, a point of friction in terms of Yemen, in terms of the Houthis. Blaise, anything else, Blaise, that you would want to add? Because it's so very interesting. What else are you watching over the next several weeks to keep an eye on?
Yeah, I think really the question is, what exactly has the United States been able to hit, and how systematically are we able to keep going after those targets in Yemen? I think the analogy here that I look at is Israel's success against Hezbollah in Lebanon, this terrorist group that everyone said was there to stay, that couldn't be defeated, that was so strongly armed. And yet in a matter of weeks, Israel was able to take them apart by killing their leadership and eliminating most of their weapons by having the intelligence of knowing where to hit. And I think that is the question. Does the United States have the intelligence to find the high-value targets, and will it continue to go after them day after day, week after week, until this group cries uncle? It can't just be one weekend. It can't just be 1 week. It has to be until this group falls apart.
Yeah, that is a commitment both financially and beyond that we'll see what happens in the region. All right, Blaise Misztal, thank you so much. I appreciate your time and everything you do at JINSA. We appreciate your insight here on Live Now.
Don't say anything, I'm still recording, but stop share. And then